Urgent. The Moscow-Tehran axis is showing signs of cracking at the most delicate moment of the crisis. On this April 20th, 2026, while Iran tries to react to the military and economic pressure from the United States in the Strait of Hormuz, the most concrete move coming from Russia was not to shield its ally, but to withdraw personnel from a strategic nuclear facility, and at the same time to expand the narrative that it can fill the gap in the energy market left by Tehran. In other words, at Iran's worst moment, Putin abandons Iran and looks after only his own interests. What happened? In practice, the Bushehr nuclear power plant in southern Iran became a clear symbol of this shift. Rosatom, the Russian state nuclear company, had already been withdrawing employees since the beginning of the war, and on April 2nd announced that it would ask the United States and Israel to respect a pause in order to complete the evacuation of more specialists. 2 days later, Reuters reported the withdrawal of another 198 employees. In other words, when the situation became more dangerous, Russia's visible action was to set up a safe exit for its own people, not to announce a tough response in defense of Tehran. Who is at the center of this? Vladimir Putin, Rosatom, and the Iranian leadership, which now sees a historic partner reducing its presence just as the pressure rises. Where does this have the most impact? In Bushehr, but also along the entire Iranian coast, which depends on the flow of energy and routes in the Gulf. This point is crucial because Bushehr is not a peripheral detail. The facility was built by the Russians, operates with strong Russian technical involvement, and has always been considered a milestone of cooperation between Moscow and Tehran. Russia is reducing this personnel presence, and the political message is heavy. The message reaching Iran is not one of shared security, but of damage control. Why? So far, public facts show Russia moving to preserve its personnel, its diplomatic leverage, and its commercial position rather than openly defending Iran. For Tehran, this feels like abandonment. And politically, abandonment at a critical moment is often seen as betrayal. At the same time, Moscow started to speak as if it already sees opportunity amid the chaos. On April 7th, the Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin said that the disruption in the Middle East has opened new business opportunities for Russia. On April 15th in Beijing, Sergei Lavrov stated that Russia was ready to compensate for the lack of energy resources for China affected by the crisis. This matters because it shows how Russia has started to present itself, not as a shield for Iran, but as an alternative supplier for those exposed to the shock in Hormuz. How does this happen? Through energy. If Iranian oil faces more barriers, Russian oil gains political and commercial space. And this change wasn't just in words. Reuters reported that Sinopec, the Chinese refining giant, bought shipments of Russian oil to replace part of the supply from the Middle East, precisely because of the increased risk in Hormuz. The report also highlighted that the company usually gets about half of its oil from the Middle East and was especially exposed to the near closure of the Strait. Who loses out because of this? Iran, which depends on energy exports and has China as its main buyer. Who gains ground? Russia, which emerges as a supplier capable of filling part of that gap. The feeling of betrayal doesn't come from a dramatic statement, but from the combination of Russia's withdrawal from Iranian territory and Russia's advance into the market that Iran risks losing. Meanwhile, the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz has intensified again. Reuters reported that Iran has tightened control over the passage, once again calling the American blockade piracy, and there have been reports of ships coming under fire. India, according to the same report, even summoned the Iranian ambassador because of Indian vessels that were hit. Then on April 20th, the situation got even worse. The United States seized an Iranian cargo ship that, according to Washington, was trying to break the blockade, and Tehran responded by promising retaliation. Now, as the temporary ceasefire enters its most fragile phase, with military interception, naval blockade, threats of new attacks, and weakened negotiations, Iran is under pressure from the outside, with the Strait choked off and the risk of a new offensive from the United States. And internally, it realizes that Russia is not acting like an ally willing to join in this confrontation. On the contrary, the Kremlin maintains diplomatic rhetoric, but the concrete reality shows something else: withdrawal of personnel, offering energy to China, and a commercial interpretation of the crisis. In simple terms, Tehran is bleeding and Moscow is looking for the best position at the table. This is not an abstraction. It's the political image that remains when a partner at war needs support and instead receives cold calculation. China perceives this risk and tries to push the situation toward reopening the Strait of Hormuz and toward negotiation. On April 13, Beijing stated that a blockade of the Strait goes against the interests of the international community. On April 20, after the seizure of the Iranian cargo ship, the Chinese Foreign Ministry called the American action a forced interception and called on all parties to act responsibly. On the same day, Xi Jinping argued in a conversation with Mohammed bin Salman that the Strait of Hormuz should remain open to normal navigation. This reveals another layer of the problem. Even the nation that buys the most Iranian oil is now working to keep maritime traffic flowing and contain escalation, not to enter into a confrontation alongside Tehran. Iran becomes more isolated. And why does all this matter so much? Because the war is no longer just military, it has also become a battle for markets, influence, and economic survival. Reuters showed that traffic in Hormuz has become almost paralyzed again, with only 3 crossings in 12 hours this Monday. And that oil prices rose by almost 5% due to fears of the collapse of the ceasefire. When the world sees ships at a standstill, risk premiums skyrocketing, and negotiations stalled, every producer tries to gain ground. Russia has already made it clear that it wants to be the one to fill that gap. Iran, on the other hand, needs to sell, needs to breathe, and needs to prove that it still controls part of the board. But the tighter the blockade gets, the weaker its position becomes. In the end, the question, who betrayed whom, might even make a strong headline. But what really matters are the visible moves. And the visible moves today are these: Russians leaving Bushehr, Moscow saying it can supply China, Chinese refiners increasing purchases of Russian oil, Hormuz under new tension, and Iran promising a response after seeing one of its cargo ships seized by the United States. The ceasefire announced on April 7 is at risk. The talks in Islamabad have lost momentum, and Donald Trump has already indicated that the blockade will continue even without a guarantee of an extension of the truce. At the moment when Tehran needs it most, Moscow pulls back from the field, speaks as a global supplier, and turns its allies' weakness into an opportunity. That's why this story is exploding with such force. It's not just about Russians leaving Tehran. It's about Iran finding out at the worst possible moment that it was more alone than it seemed.